Hey guys, so let's set the timer. Where we left off last time was talking about assumptions of cause. That there are four causes of us behaving, four causes of essentially who and what we are. And these four causes are, of course, nature stuff, physics, chemistry, biology stuff. Nurture stuff, transformation of us through space and time. And in psychology, we tend to look at how people were raised, how they were shaped through early and more recent experiences. Formal cause, the hardest one for many of us to wrap our heads around, the cause of context. And then the final cause, the cause of purpose. So each of these causes are offering different implications of how we treat people. If we assume the material cause, if we assume the cause of nature, then our interventions are likely going to be biological interventions of some kind. If we assume the cause of nurture, then our interventions are going to be like getting into early childhood, early trauma, and then recreating new experiences for the client moving forward. If we assume the cause of context, then we're going to be looking very much here and now at what's going on in our clients' lives, what's going on in their whole life context, and doing what we can to intervene on a contextual level in order to help the client. And granted, the client is part of their own context, so therefore that's also a place to intervene. And then the cause of purpose is when we begin to really look at the way in which the purpose of a thing causes the thing, and in mental health, the way it is that much of our symptomology is purposeful, that these therapists tend to come at intervention in terms of how does this behavior make sense? What does the behavior mean? What is the purpose of these particular feelings, of these particular behavings? And so the symptoms aren't seen in a vacuum, but rather purposeful. And sometimes the purpose is elusive, and sometimes it's very subtle, and sometimes it's paradoxical or downright contradictory. However, they tend to assume there's a purpose. So of all of those, when we think in terms of nature plus nurture, it is still deterministic to bring in and to evoke agency, right? Human agency. So remember, we have three broad categories of human choice. Free will, meaning that free will is radical, unconstrained, and unconstrainable. Then there's agency, meaning that there's other things going on besides free choice that inform the choices that we make and how. And then determinism, meaning that there is no choice. Choice is either non-existent altogether or an illusion. And so agency relates to causality, relates to agency. Both of them then relate to epistemology. So there are four epistemologies we're going to talk about in this unit. Two we're going to talk about during this video, and then the other two we're going to talk about in the next video on epistemology. So the two we're going to talk about in this unit are Lockean empiricism, shorthand either Lockean or empiricism, and Kantian rationalism, which we will probably foreshorten as either Kantian or rationalism. In our next unit, we will talk about social constructionism and hermeneutic interpretivism, also known as constructivism and interpretivism, respectively. So, Lockean empiricism. Now, there's an important caveat going into this, that what I'm about to say doesn't actually represent the philosophies of John Locke himself very well at all. John Locke's epistemology is far more sophisticated than what I'm about to share, and has more wiggle room around non-empirical things than what I'm about to share. So in the history and systems class, for those of you who are going to take that as your capstone, we'll get into the psychology of John Locke a little bit more intensely. Allergies acting up, cotton is blowing. So we'll get into John Locke and then later Immanuel Kant as well, and we'll find that the way psychology takes up these assumptions is different than what these scholars actually had to say. So, when it comes to Lockean empiricism is the position that what creates our knowing and creates our knowledge is stimuli from the outside world impinging upon our physical senses that then causes a nervous system response, and which is then stored in the brain. So, according to this particular set of assumptions, where you really need to unpack it, of course John Locke spelled it all out. He wondered if we weren't born tabula rasa. Tabula, like a tablet, rasa meaning blank, meaning empty. And so when we are born, we are this empty tablet. And the world creates stimuli. The world is constantly emitting energy. And it's emitting different lots of different kinds of energy that our bodies are sensitive to. There's light energy, right? There's sound energy. There's chemical energy. And all of this our bodies are sensitive to, and then our bodies react to. And those reactions then cause nervous system vibrations that are then stored in the brain. So other more modern theorists would talk about it as schemas, that these particular stimuli in the environment are recorded in the brain, and that similar stimuli that tend to happen together a lot are then recorded in the same part of a brain, and then that forms a schema. That forms like a knowledge nugget, a file in our hard drive, in our mental hard drive, that's where the knowledge is stored. And so there are 20-something physical senses. I'm pretty good at remembering 10 of them. Let's see if I can remember them off the top of my head. So there's sight, smell, taste, touch, hearing. Okay. Then there is our sense of balance, called our vestibular sense, the sense of our body parts in relation to one another, which is our kinesthetic sense. Then there is the sense of our own body chemistry, so it's called chemoception, meaning that we have a sense of how we are feeling. Like when you're feeling a little sick, there's nothing outside of you causing that inward sick feeling when you're starting to get sick, when you're a little off. For those of you that are diabetic, you know where I'm coming from. You can feel when your blood sugar is high or when your insulin is high. That's chemoception. And then there is thermoception, meaning our sense of hot and cold. And then there's nociception, which is our sense of pain. And so those are just 10 of the 20-something physical senses. And the others are harder for me to remember, so I'm sure you could look up a Wikipedia version of it. Regardless, it is through these physical senses, and you'll notice that some of them are energy, certain forms of energy, like radioactive energy, others are radio energy, and then others are chemical energy, and others are pressure. For example, touch and hearing are both pressure senses, right? That when we are touched, it is due to the pressure sensors in our bodies. And then when we hear things, it's due to the pressure of sound waves. Likewise, there's chemical energy. Chemoception, our internal bodily chemistry is obviously one of those. But likewise, our sense of smell and our sense of taste, right? These are chemical. And then there's, of course, there's radio. There's radiation energy. And that's, heat, cold, sight, things like that. They rely on energy being transmitted through radio waves, long and short wave radio waves to our body. So light, infrared energy, X-ray energy, like heat is infrared. And so some of you are saying, man, it's technically not those things. Yeah, you're right. That's not the point. The point is that there are different receptors in our body that then are very sensitive to stimuli in the environment. So energy comes in, and if it triggers a part of our nervous system, part of our nerve endings, whatever those kind of nerve endings are, that is information, and that information is then stored in the brain. So there can be all these things going on out in the world, but if it doesn't come into my physical senses, then it's not a thing, right? It has no influence at all on my thinking, feeling, and behaving. So there are those after John Locke who radicalized this, that the only knowledge is knowledge that comes through the physical senses. Everything else is not knowledge. And it's interesting what they do with this particular word, because knowledge means something different depending on the epistemology you're studying. So to a Lockean empiricist, knowledge is knowing that which is factually true. And so if you seem to know something that is actually factually false, then that's a problem. It's not really knowledge, it's neuroses or misprogramming or something like that. And so knowledge claims and truth claims become very conjoined. They become very intertwined, where if I say, this happened on this date, I remember it, and I know that this thing happened, I'm making a very strong truth claim of a particular sort. A particular sort means that at that date, at that time, these stimuli in the environment caused a reaction in my nerve endings, which was then stored in my brain. So at this date, at this time, these following things happened. And so that's a very interesting way of asserting knowledge. So what they're looking at is a knowledge that is factual, meaning that that really happened. It's valid, meaning it happened in the way that you are saying it is, and it's reliable, meaning that if there are other people there, that they saw or experienced the same thing too. And it is objective, meaning regardless of your opinion on the matter, that thing happened. So valid, reliable, objective, sensible, right? Meaning not sensible as in wise, but sensible as in sensible with our physical senses. And so they really privilege knowledge and truth claims in a very particular way. It's very interesting to us, the way they do this. And that assumption very much informs a lot of so-called science. Now, not all science. We'll talk about some very interesting issues of physics, etc. here in a minute. But for now, it's objective, it's reliable, it's valid, it's recordable, etc. So therefore, what is known and what is knowable comes from these particular physical senses. So therefore, if I want to know something, I need to sense something in an objective, reliable, valid way. So therefore, other people can verify what it is that I know. And so that informed one understanding of science going forward. And that is that here's a method that we're going to set up such that we expose data, expose the sensorium to our physical senses, and then record them. And so I'm going to set up this way of getting data, these ways of setting up physical sensations, and then I'm going to have you do the same in a remotely distant location. And if we come up with the same observation about the same thing, then therefore we know that it is coming closer to meeting our standard of knowledge, our standard of truth, okay? And so you see how that could lead to a particular model of science, that I'm going to expose myself to this particular thing, and then I am going to ask other people to do the same, and I'm going to follow a particular method of exposure and then ask other people to do the same. And then we will see what comes out of that. And so if for example, I expose myself to how people behave in traffic in a particularly objective, reliable, valid way here in Utah County, and I have somebody else do it in Utah County, and we get the same result, even though one person is in one part of the county, another person's in another, then we know, okay, behavior in this county, we've exposed ourselves to it, and it tends to follow along these lines, and then we do it over and over and over again, and then we grow more and more confident in our truth claims. So this seems important and helpful. The question is, does it stand up to scrutiny? So let's think about it for a minute. Is knowledge, is what can be known, limited to physical senses that is then objectively, reliably, and validly measurable by another human being in another situation? Okay, So let's say I'm mixing vinegar and baking soda to get a nice foamy up reaction. Okay, so if I were to do that here at my dining table, and then I were to have you do it at home, and you used a particular type of vinegar, and I tell you what type of vinegar to use, and I use that same one, type of baking soda, and then you and I are very careful about the quantities, we're going to get very similar results regardless of where you are when you watch this video and regardless of where I am filming this video, right? That we would have a similar experience in common. So we could make certain knowledge claims, right? That this vinegar mixed with this baking soda creates this amount of foam or bubbles up this amount. Let's say we even specify the type and size of container that we're using, that it bubbles up in this particular container in this particular way to this degree or to this magnitude. And so we could replicate that all day long, and we could actually learn something about how much foam is created by a mixture of vinegar and baking soda. Cool, we have our epistemology. That's how everybody knows everything in the whole world. We're done. But wait. We're psychologists, not third graders at a science fair mixing baking soda and water. So how about something else? Let's say light. Light seems very important to understand because human beings seem to be very visual creatures. Now, we're not the most visual creatures in the animal kingdom, but we are very visual creatures. And there's a lot of perception psychology, a lot of Gestalt perception psychology, other perception psychologies privilege sight because we are so sight-based. Like, I haven't read an article on perceiving our environment through taste in a very long time. There's very few studies on that, although to some of us who really like our sense of taste, that seems important to us, and it's an important way for us to learn. Regardless, sight is one of those things that's privileged, and light is what allows sight to happen. With no light, we don't see anything. So therefore, maybe let's look at light itself. Does light always behave in the same way across contexts? And the answer is no. Many of you are familiar with the double slit experiment, where certain scientists, and I apologize, I'm blanking on their name. My workout this morning was really hard, so I'm a little foggy. But they set up an experiment where they found that wave behaves as a wavelength, as a wave, as an energy wave in some manifestations in the experiment, and as a particle at the same time. And so this creates a certain paradox in science, that in some circumstances, light behaves as a particle. In other circumstances, light behaves as a wave. So what is light? Is it a particle or is it a wave? And the answer is yes, because they can't figure it out. And some of you were saying, well, man, according to quantum mechanics, right, but that's an epistemology well outside of empiricism. Okay, that's in a whole nother realm. So when we're looking at empiricism, it doesn't make sense that an object can be two different things depending on the method that we use to measure it. And that's what the double slit experiment is famous for. So are there other limitations to this particular epistemology? If we're crying out loud, our knowledge of light begins to fall apart using the methods implied by this particular epistemology. What else does? In fact, as psychologists, I'm really biased in the direction of human phenomena, meaning stuff that humans know and that humans experience, and our sense of sight is very important. And yet that's not necessarily where my concern lies as a psychologist. My concern lies on the things that my clients bring to the table. And they bring to the table stories and experiences of pain. Stories and experiences of love, of heartbreak. Stories and experiences of happiness, even joy. So if we use these constructs, pain, happiness, sadness, joy, love, indifference, if we bring up these particular subjects, how does this epistemology give us truth claims about these experiences? And in fact, can these experiences even exist in an empirical world? Or are we knowing merely phantasms and merely illusions? So let's take up pain first. There is a scale. It's a very interesting measuring technique. It is our most sophisticated, most scientifically valid and accurate measurement for human pain ever devised. It's more sophisticated and gives us better data than a functional MRI, so where we stuff people in a tube and then examine up their brains and metabolism in their brains, looking for what parts of their brain and nervous system are active. It's better than that. It's better than just about anything we've come up with. Any chemical, like blood samples of cortisol, for example, look at people's stress levels, it's better than that. And you've seen it if you've been to a doctor's office. It is a series of boxes, and inside the boxes is a little cartoony face, a little round face. On one end is a smiley face, 1 or 0. And this is a measurement of pain, meaning if you're no pain at all, it's a 0. And then it goes all the way to 10. And the little cartoony face looks more and more distressed as you go across the scale, okay? This is called the Wong-Baker Faces Scale, okay? That is our most sophisticated empirical measure of pain. Let that sink in for a minute. Through there, you see how we get to and why we should critique empiricism as an epistemology? For crying out loud! There is no way for you to objectively, reliably, and validly measure the pain I am in. You can't sense my pain. There is no sensorium going on for you about my pain. None. So therefore, there is no objective observation, there's no valid observation, and there's no reliable observation of my pain. My pain does not empirically exist to you. Now, we could argue that it empirically exists to me, but because it's not objective, reliable, and valid, it is not a truth claim, meaning I can't tell the world I am in pain and have that be a scientifically true claim. It is a subjective, unreliable, invalid claim. And so therefore, are you going to take my pain seriously? If you're a scientist, the answer is no, because it doesn't exist. Okay? There's nothing about what's going on with my nociception, my pain, that is empirically, validly, reliably, objectively measurable at all. I can tell you my subjective opinion. I can point at the little square and say, I am at pain level 8. It's agonizing. But you don't know if I'm lying or not. Maybe I'm acting. There's no way for you to verify. And so some people go, well, we could maybe do empirical corollaries. Like I suffer from arthritis in my back pretty bad. And so I'm often in pain. And what's really humbling for me is I saw the x-ray of my uncle. I saw the x-ray on his back. Now my back's in pretty bad shape, but his back is in far worse shape than mine. But he experiences no pain, the lucky bastard. And so for him, he's like, oh, I didn't know my back was in such bad shape. Oh, well, back to work. You know what I mean? And then for me, I'm like, oh, moving is agony. How am I out of bed? You know what I mean? And so there was no empirical referent to our pain. In fact, some physicians, some osteopaths, like sports medicine doctors, went through and just started taking random scans of people's spines, just taking them off the street, and found that there was a zero-order correlation between the empirically, directly observable back problems and the amount of back pain somebody experienced. None. It was a zero correlation, meaning that somebody could have a spine like a pretzel, not even know it, and be perfectly functional in their life. Somebody else has one vertebra slightly out of alignment, and they have radiant pain up their face or down their arm or down their leg, you know, depending on where the vertebra is. And so they're like, what do we do with this data? That there is no empirical referent for pain, meaning there's nothing we can reliably, objectively, validly refer back to using our physical empirical senses about somebody else's pain. We can't do it. And so pain doesn't empirically exist. So imagine you have a science, say a psychological science, that is rested in empiricism, or that it assumes empiricism. Think of the implications that would have for treatment. you wouldn't actually be treating pain. You'd be treating the noises people make about their pain. Because them saying, I'm in pain, that is empirically observable, reliable, and valid. No matter who's in the room and hears me go, I'm in pain, then they're all going to hear it, right? So therefore they're going to be treating the words, I'm in pain. They're not going to treat the pain itself. So they might punish me for using the term, I'm in pain, right, to get me to shut my mouth. They might give me narcotics to get me to shut my mouth. But regardless, they're going to treat the symptom. They're not going to treat the pain itself, right? Somebody say, well, Matt, narcotics would treat the pain. Unless I'm lying, in which case I'm just using the narcotics to get high. And you have no way of knowing. And somebody say, well, Matt, I can tell. Yes, but I bet you it's not empirical. I bet you it's not. As somebody who works in addictions and who has been a part of the addictions world for a very long time, there are people who can sniff it out, but they're often wrong, okay? Not all the way. There's some colleagues of mine who are right more than half the time, which is eerily good, but there's no empirical referent. They go with their gut, and we'll talk about that with another epistemology. So pain has no empirical referent. Guess what? Neither does happiness. Think of a time you have been perfectly content, but were you laughing and giggling and smiling? Were there emitted sensorium emitted stimuli from your body going out into the world where people could objectively, reliably measure the emitted stimuli? And even if you are, and even if you could, there's this thing called acting. No one knows what's going on with you emotionally. You can act according to your emotions, but as many people out there are very much trained not to. Women, for example, in this culture, in the research that we have done, we have found that women are punished around expressions of assertions and expressions of anger. So therefore, women learn not to assert themselves, especially not when they're angry, because of the amount of social blowback they get. So therefore, you can have a woman who is really angry and really trying to assert herself, but has been punished and doesn't know how. Now, I appreciate that some of you have no problem getting angry regardless of gender and have no problem asserting yourself. These are proportions, and don't think, again, fourth dimensional thinking, not second dimensional thinking. Likewise with men. Do you know how rare it is that we men are allowed to cry? Like, I'm an accommodations assistant. After losing my son to cancer a couple of years ago and all the agony that went into that loss, tending him every day, the screams in the middle of the night, no narcotic would touch it again and again, it leaves a mark on a fella, okay? I love my son and I miss him, and I'm very sorry for the horrific way he died. And that also has had great effect, not only on my health, but the health of the rest of the family. I didn't have many of these health problems until this particular experience occurred, and then I learned it's very common. Cortisol does terrible things to the body, especially when your body's flooded with cortisol for over a year. And so I have to fight with the administration to get my American with Disabilities Act approved IA. I have to fight with them. And I have to remind them that that's a thing. And I'm getting pushback because they think I should be over it by now. We men are not allowed to cry. We're not allowed to suffer. We're not allowed to have feelings. And when we do, we get pushback. And some of you say, well, that's dudes. That's what other dudes do. No, the people I have to push back against are all women. And so it's gendered in a way where, Matt, you should be over this by now. Okay? I don't want them to go through this, but I am curious how they would be a couple years after they go through an experience like that, and how they would be 10 years or 20 years later. It changes you. So in some ways for the better, and in some ways it weakens you. And so for men, for example, we're not allowed to evince or express our pain. Well, Matt, what does that have to do with empiricism, and what does it have to do with psychotherapy? And the answer is everything. Do you know how incredibly anxiety-provoking it is for me and for my client? Well, it's far less for me because I'm not the one put in the situations, but it's far more anxiety-provoking for my clients when I'm working with, say, a young lady who's in a position where she is justifiably angry. Issue with a boyfriend or with a parent or things like that. And when she tries to assert herself, she is shut down and she's told that she's being bitchy or she must be on her period or things like that when she's making reasonable requests in a perfectly reasonable way and her environment is punishing her for that. If I don't have a way of treating the pain itself or even acknowledging that the pain is there, then how can I help her? Likewise, it's amazing to me how powerful compliments are to guys. Giving a man space to cry where he's not judged is extremely powerful. And so I can remember years ago in prison, there was a man I knew, and he shared something pretty powerful with me, a story about his own father and the trauma of losing his father at a very young age, and how, although they lived a pretty heavy metal lifestyle before that, that really spun him out of control. There was nobody around to process grief, nobody around. He could cry. He was expected to suck up, man up. And at the end of our chat, I got up and just gave him a bump. It's where you start with a handshake, and then you transition the hands this, or your clasp this way, and then you boom, bump. It's just a bump, you know what I mean, with your fists between your chest. And then he sat down, and just the tears just came out of him. As hard as the subject matter was that we had been talking about for him to discuss and to revisit, that's the first time he had been touched in a kind way in 6 years. How many men can snuggle up and do snuggle up in the bosoms of their love and just cry when they've had a bad day? No, it's punished out of us. And so, therefore, it's really interesting that all of these things are not empirical events. And so if we have an empirical psychology, we're missing out on pain. We can't measure it. We can't do anything with it. We can ask people, give them a survey about how much emotional pain they're in, but we have no way of empirically verifying it. We can empirically verify their responses on the survey, and we have to trust that they're telling us the truth. But we don't know if we're empiricists. Likewise, love. Think of somebody you know who loves you, but they don't have a love language for you. They don't give you words of affirmation, loving words. They don't give you gifts. They don't come up and touch you, physical touch. The love is there, and it is real, and it is powerful. But you know they love you, but they never empirically use the words, I love you. How do you know? There is some other way of knowing. Likewise, how do you know when you love somebody? There are probably people you know that you don't give gifts to, or words of affirmation, or try to have sex with. But there's, not to say that you have sex with all the people you love, there's different kinds of love, and later in the unit we'll get into that. In the unit on Christian therapies, we'll get into that. But love is a huge issue, right? Issues of longing and heartache and reconciliation, forgiveness, all of these issues of love are huge in therapy. And we don't have any way of talking about it empirically. So I could go on and on and on and on about the limits of empiricism, the way it just doesn't work. In fact, even on the science side, one of the things I chuckle at is we use devices all the time, believing them to be empirically scientific devices when they're not empirically scientific devices, like math. We think that the more sophisticated the statistics, the math is in our study, the more sciencey McScience it is. No, actually the less empirical science. It's science, but it's a different kind of science, right? This isn't empirical science anymore. What you are now doing is math. You're not doing science anymore, in empirical science anymore. Like, for example, what's the square root of -1? Or somebody's saying, Matt, I'm a psychology major because I hate math. I get that. The square root of -1 is represented as an I, an italicized I, which means an imaginary number, right? It's just imaginary. There is so much that goes on in advanced mathematics that has no empirical referent. I can remember doing quadratic equations. These are things that just exist on their own without an empirical referent. Now, you can bring the tool of a quadratic equations to empirical events in order to measure them in certain ways, but the quadratic equation itself doesn't. The italicized letter I doesn't. My brother-in-law was working for Lockheed Martin, and he once showed me some of the math that went in, physics and math that went behind the engineering of the 777, which is this unbelievably large passenger plane. It just boggles my imagination when I see one of those on a runway. It's just huge. It's a flying city. And I was surprised years ago to see how many times I is in their equations. basically, next time you get on an airplane, mathematically speaking, you're flying on imagination. You're flying on a physicist and engineer's imagination. How's that for comforting? And yet the planes work, and it's a very reliable mode of transportation. So empiricism lies to us that what we know comes to us through our physical senses. Our physical senses seem important, and we can know stuff from them, but not truth. And even then, what we know, like Liz, famous researcher on memory, Liz Loftus. Liz Loftus went through and she set up experiments where people empirically observed phenomenon, and then their responses about the phenomenon they observed changed depending on the question she asked about the phenomenon. So therefore, even though it was the same sensorium that went into all of her research subjects' head meats, even though it was all the sensorium, the way she asked the question caused the knowledge to change, if it was knowledge at all. And so therefore, even our being able to sense things and remember them is very, very different, right? That's not reliable, objective, or valid. Therefore, all of empiricism is built on, it's a house of cards. It's built on a foundation of lies. That's not actually how knowledge works. And so there are others, of course, who have an answer to that, and that is the rationalists. Ratio in Latin means reason, right? That it's not sensorium that causes us to have knowledge, it's reason. And so are the method and style of reasoning and the exactitude and accuracy of that style of reasoning, the rigor of our reasoning, that determines what we know and what we don't. So like empiricism, rationalism is also a methodism, meaning that there's a method to it, that you follow a method and then that comes to knowledge, right? You follow a rational method or empirical method and that leads to knowing. In rationalism, they really assert that there are a lot of things, mathematics, for example, that don't have empirical reference, that these are strictly reasoned events. There's no objective, reliable, valid external stimuli about math. Likewise, there aren't about a lot of things like ethics. Like Kant is better known to be an ethicist, I found, than an epistemologist. However, he had to work out his epistemology in order to work out his ethics. So he wrote more on ethics, I suppose, than on epistemology, but he needed to get his epistemology down pat. Kant observed that we come into the world reasoning beings, that we come into the world already having the capacity to know. We have certain knowledges already going on. And I think in terms of three of my biological children, for example, the three surviving, that they each came into the world already different people. There weren't stimuli in the environment that caused them to know different things. And some of you say, well, Matt, in utero, when they're just a fetus, that's a particular environment and there's different stimuli there. Yes, but the stimuli is extremely muted. The environmental conditions are identical, and therefore we should see much more similarity than difference. And my kids were very different people. Jotham, for example, my eldest, came into the world contemplatively. He just came into the world contemplating. Like, I can remember holding him in my arms when he first opened his eyes, and he just looked around. He was just taking the world in. So this very thoughtful expression on his newborn infant face. Diamelin came into the world talking, not full English sentences, but she came into the world, and right after she opened her eyes, she started making noises with her mouth. And you'd never guess it today, because if you hung out Diamelin, she's very quiet, but man, she was very talkative up until about the age of 8 or so. And so she came into the world talking, like she was asking me questions about God at 18 months, for crying out loud. She would want to be a part of the grown-up conversations. Today, like, she's 20, and like there's a group of people sitting around this table, we'll be talking about politics or philosophy or therapy or something else, something like that. We have a lot of dinners here, and she's always on the periphery of those conversations. She just loves the part of language. She loves participating. Then there's my youngest, Jareth. He came into the world explosively. No, that's too violent. He came into the world energetically. It's almost like he was at a runner's starting block, and then when he finally came out of his mother's womb, he like sprinted out so hard, boing, just like popped right off those blocks. So much so like the bungee caught and nearly bunging him back up into his mom. Like he was just energetic, like he was just wriggling and just excited to be outside of his mother. Like he was, and again, for him, until he started getting really big, which really slowed him down, as a little kid, he was very active. He was very energetic. And so they came into the world different people, so therefore there are different things that each of them know, each of them knew, each of them still know, apart from one another. And they came into the world already knowing these things. So Kant wonders a little bit about Descartes. In fact, he's a critic of Descartes, but he also refines some of Descartes' thinking. That Descartes talks about how it is that we're not born with born tabula rasa. Instead, we seem to be born with the capacity to become aware of the way in which we're always already seeing the world. So Descartes argued that we have rose-colored glasses, and that our vision is always already colored by our subjective perception of things. And so one of the things that Kant and Descartes are a little bit cautious about is making strong truth claims about the world and our observations of the world, given that we're the ones observing it and our observations are always already colored. So with Kant, for example, he breaks the world down into two parts. There is the noumena and the phenomena. The noumena is the world as it actually empirically, physically, objectively, reliably, validly exists, right? It is the world apart from me. So then there's the phenomena. The phenomena is my experience of that world, my subjective experience of that world. We can never access the noumena, right? It's this radical claim he makes that all we ever have of the world is our experience of it, and therefore that always tempers and humbles any truth claims we have about the world, because we can set up whatever methods we want to check our own biases, but we also have biases against our own biases, that no matter where we go, we need to apply exacting rules of reason rather than relying on the thing itself in order to come to any conclusions. Okay, so therefore knowledge is an internal event, and that there are certain categories of understanding that we develop as we mature as human beings. That it starts off with the very simple things that babies can understand before language: hot, cold, pain, pleasure, hungry, full, the very simple categories of understanding. And then later the time is added, and texture, and of course ethics and moral understanding. And so there was over 70 of these categories of understanding that Kant came up with before his career ended. So we are born into the world, and we are already subjectively perceiving the world, so much so we can never escape our subjectivity. And there are methods that we can use to learn about the world in whatever approximately shareable form, like, again, the vinegar baking soda experiment, that there are things we can do, methods we can set up in order to come to some kind of conclusion about what we're doing, but the methods are about reasoning, not about observation. And so we also see that in psychological science today. That is that there's very clear reasoning. There's inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning. In fact, psychology is far more inductive than deductive. And therefore, we set up these particular methods and style, like what are the rules about rejecting or failing to reject the null hypothesis? How do you set your significance level in a study? How do you logically argue through what kind of study you're going to do and why? All of this is very Kantian. And so there's a schizophrenia in the science of psychology, because on the one hand it purports to be empirically scientific. On the other hand, it's all about logic, it's all about reasoning. And so therefore it seems like reasoning more often than not trumps direct observation. But when you highlight that, let's say you're at a conference and you say, the way you're reasoning about this very much colors how you asked your empirical question, why you asked it, how you did your lit review, why you did your lit review, how you asked your hypothesis, how you gathered your data, how you set up and developed your measure, how you then interpreted your results, and how then you wrote your conclusion. All of that is phenomena stuff, not noumena stuff. All of that is in the world of subjective experience following certain rules of logic, and it had actually increasingly less and less to do with the thing itself. And so, and then psychology, as psychology is filled, goes, oh no, we need to get back to the thing itself, we need to be an empirical science. And so then they'll try to argue back that way, but you'll notice they're using rules of rationalism and logic in order to argue that they're actually being empirical. So what are the limits of rationalism? Well, the empiricists are very quick to point out the limits of rationalism. And that is, it doesn't matter what I call this red-hot poker. It doesn't matter how I reason about this red-hot poker. When it's jammed in your eyeball, it hurts really, really bad and does a certain amount of damage, right? It doesn't matter my logic and reasoning about a .357 Magnum bullet as it's cutting through my guts. It's going to do a certain amount of damage. And there's the world itself. It doesn't matter if my logic fails to account for the way gravity works on a particular object at a particular time. Gravity always works there. And so therefore the thing itself, they keep pushing towards, we need to be reasoning about the thing itself. We need to keep looking about the thing itself. And if our reasoning fails to account for the thing itself, we need to go back to the thing itself. So like in physics, for example, the reason string theory, although it accounts for a lot of things in terms of possibility, especially at the super macro level, like the size of galaxies and universes, as well as the extreme micro level, the quantum level, the math works out elegantly to explain things on both ends of that spectrum. But in terms of practical experiments, none of the predictions of string theory at the meso level, at this medium level, of this desktop, of this conversation, pan out. So string theory is on the one hand very full because it mathematically elegantly explains things, and then empty because when we return to things itself, like the phenomena that happen here at this dinner table, it doesn't predict them. And any of the experiments that are derived from the predictions of string theory don't come out at the meso level, and it's very hard to do experiments, as you know, at the quantum level and at the super macro level of galaxies. Galaxies tend to do their own thing regardless of our opinion or our efforts to manipulate them. So therefore, the empiricists say you need to come back to the thing itself. It doesn't matter what your reasoning and logic is. The thing itself still has weight. It still has force. That is ultimately where the information comes from. And the rationalists go, but what do you mean by information? Like, there are certain ways of thinking about and categorizing information versus non-information, truth from lies, that if those aren't in place, then your observations mean nothing, and they war back and forth. Cool. Then there's a criticism of both of those. And that criticism is, all of this is a language game. The way you guys talk about objectivity, validity, etc., and the way you privilege those and value those, that's happening in a very particular cultural position at a very particular time using very particular language. That other people seem to be doing very well in their societies and cultures without this language game you guys call empirical science. Likewise, all of these things about having rules of reason, etc., that are somehow you believe to be universally true, they're not. It's you quirky social science types, you rationalist types that are thinking this and valuing this. It's other people are living perfectly fine lives with their particular truth claims, which come from very different epistemologies. So therefore, you guys are just constructing all of these. So let me see how I'm doing on time. Oh, perfect timing. So I'm going to rest my voice for just a minute, and then we will have the next unit on social constructionism and interpretivism. And so we will get to those next.